lecture 5. But I'm going to start with lecture 4, of course. And as I also promised you in the direct sessions last time, before starting telling you about lecture 4 and repeating it, I have just given you some examples of the types of the questions you are going to have in the final. As I told you, the final is going to be multiple choice. All of the questions are going to be multiple choice. I have given you 3 questions that could be considered good samples of the type of the questions you are going to have in the final exam. So, I have written that below are samples of the questions that you will have in the final. As you note, all of the questions in the final will be multiple choice questions. You have 3 questions. This is 1, and this is 2. As you have seen, the type of meaning we discussed was A, B, C, D, and you have to choose one of them. And you have a 3rd question. In other words, I have given you 3 questions that could be considered good samples, good examples of the type of the question, inshallah, that you are going to have in the final exam. Okay, now I will start with the 4th lecture, and it is entitled Who's and What's. Who, as you remember, who, as you do remember, means the identity you wish to appear to be seen by other people. In other words, you behave in a way that help you appear in a certain way according to what you wish. So you might speak in a way in order to appear as rich, or as formal, or as informal. In other words, these are identities you achieve to yourself through the speak you use. So, when you speak or write anything, you use the resources of English to project, to present, to introduce yourself as a certain kind of person, a different kind in different circumstances. Sometimes in the house, you want to appear as a father. So the relation is father-son, for example. But in the lecture, you might wish to appear as a doctor. So the type of the language you use differs from a situation into another situation depending on the identity you wish to achieve or the identity you do play. A father or a professor, a friend, or for example a teacher, and so on and so forth. You also project yourself as engaged in a certain kind of activity. You yourself differs from being the same person if you are in a meeting or if you are in your house. In other words, the situation determines to a great extent the language you use, the identity you have. You also project yourself as engaged in a certain kind of activity, a different kind in different circumstances. If I have no idea who you are and what you are doing, then I cannot make sense of what you have said, written, or done. In other words, the activity you are engaged in to a great extent also can tell me who you are and why you do use that language but not another language. An oral or written utterance has meaning then only if and when it communicates a who and a what. A who you are. A what kind of activity you are engaged in. So, the activity you are engaged in, meeting for example, lecturing, whatever, and the who, the identity you have at that time, to a great extent help me understand the utterance you write or the utterance you say. An oral written utterance has meaning then only if and when it communicates a who and a what. What I mean by a who is a socially situated identity. Being a father, your identity, being a local, being an Indian, native Indian, being a teacher, okay, being non-local, for example. What I mean by a who is a socially situated identity, the kind of person one is seeking to be and enact here and now. If you are in a lecture hall, you like to appear as a doctor. You behave in a certain way. You behave in a way that makes others talk talk to you as a professor. In other words, you will act formally in order to determine the type of the behavior you are going to receive from the rest of the people. What I mean by who is a socially situated identity, the kind of person one is seeking to be and enact here and now. What I mean by a what is a socially, the society is what determines things. What I mean by a what is a socially situated activity that the utterance helps to constitute. As I told you, the written material is the most important thing. It is the best summary for the book. Just you can depend on it for your final exam. Lots of interesting complications can set in when we think about identity enacted in and through language. Whose can be multiple, and they need not always be people. For example, what I mean by whose can be multiple and they need not always be people. For example, if the president's press secretary can issue an utterance that is in fact authored by a speech writer and authorized by the president. The same utterance is made up by three people: the secretary who issued it, the president who authorized it, and the writer who made it. So, whose can be multiple. It can be multiple, and they need not always be people. The president's press secretary can issue an utterance that is in fact authored by a speech writer, the writer who authored it, and authorized by the president. So once the president addresses his people, what he says is indeed something which is written by somebody else, issued by somebody else, and said by the president only. In other words, it is what I mean whose can be multiple. The press secretary, even if she is directly quoting the speechwriter, must inflect the remark with her own voice. In turn, the speechwriter is both mimicking the president's voice and creating an identity for him. An utterance can be authored, the same thing that I have just said, authorized by or issued by a group or a single individual. So this is possible that who can be multiple, or it could be a single individual. Finally, we can point out that whose and what's are not really discrete and separable. Indeed, no. You are who, in other words, you are who you are partly through what you are doing, and what you are doing is partly recognized for what it is by who is doing it. In other words, who you are is determined by what you are doing. If you are in your house, you will play the role of a father. So what you do can tell me that you are a father. You will ask, for example, your son, study. Have you studied? Your daughter, go to the kitchen. Do the dishes, washing the dishes, for example. So this is the role of a father. The same father, if he goes to a classroom, he will act in a way that will help you create for him a new identity. Professor, a teacher, tutor, and so on and so forth. Finally, we can point out that whose and what's are not really discrete and separable. No, at all. You are who you are partly through what you are doing. If now I'm doing my job as a lecturing, this is my identity, professor. If I go home, I will play another role. If I am with my friend, I will be a friend. So, whose is changeable. You yourself can be multiple identities, in other words, depending on the activities you are engaged in. That's all with regard to lecture 4. I would like to thank you.